So I'm like many years late to the party in Star Wars, but I've recently seen the films and I thoroughly enjoyed them. I'm actually currently watching my way through the Clone Wars, the animated series. That series also presented a few elements that can be discussed here, at least from what I've seen so far. I'm like 1.5 seasons through right now, so maybe if I do catch up to the Clone Wars, I'll make a follow-up to this video. But back to the point, I don't really have anything to say about Star Wars that hasn't been said already since the fandom is so ginormous. But since this channel is all about me talking about whatever I like, I'll throw my 2 cents in anyway. Throughout the many things I enjoyed in this series, awesome lightsaber battles, awesome non-lightsaber battle scenes, great characters, and a very interesting universe, one thing stood out to me more than any other, and that is how the fictional world of Star Wars delved into authoritarianism in a very realistic way. Star Wars is not very candid on who is good and who is evil in the series. The light side and the dark side are two literal, tangible forces in the Star Wars universe, and that of course plays itself into the narrative. You would think that the antagonistic forces of Star Wars would then be rather conventionally evil, but the one thing about the dark side of the Force that actually rung so true about the real world was how exactly it created the conditions that was conducive to its success. In a lot of media, evil forces generally impose themselves on their world through brute force or straight up sorcery or something like that. In Star Wars, the Galactic Empire was formed through a long and complex process of political maneuvering and opportunism. Despite how stereotypically evil people like Darth Sidious and Darth Vader were for most of the series, I think George Lucas and his team had a statement to make about how authoritarianism comes to be. Now, I don't know how intentional this symbolism may have been, but I do know that George Lucas has a reputation for being quite an intense man that takes his work very seriously, so it wouldn't be a surprise if this was by design. Now, the process looks more straightforward if Star Wars is viewed in chronological order, from episodes 1 to 6, but it gets pretty interesting if you see it in release order, from 4 to 6, and then 1 to 3. One of the first things we learn about Darth Vader is that him and the Emperor dismantled the Senate, claiming that the last remnants of the Old Republic were gone as a result. There's also that one commander who berated Vader and called the Jedi arts an ancient religion. These few lines, mostly in passing, allude to the dismemberment of the previous society. The first 3 movies seem to mostly focus on the characters and Luke Skywalker's fated meeting with his father, but we are then left in suspense about how exactly the Empire came to be. Once Phantom Menace rolls around, we are shown the socio-political dynamics surrounding the Old Republic. We see turmoil afoot in basically every corner of the Star Wars universe. Perceived unfair taxation caused an uprising among the galaxy's financial sectors, creating a large-scale political and military standoff with no solution in sight. The peace of the Republic was then being trampled upon, Naboo's surface capital was occupied by the Separatist armies, and the threat of complete takeover was looming. Senate was stagnant on the issue, and inaction and corruption plagued the political world. Slavery flourished despite anti-slavery laws on planets like Tatooine where the Republic's law did not reach. Later, a formal army was amassed by the Republic, mostly consisting of clones, which escalated tensions further and caused widespread death, destruction, and discontent in their war with the Separatists. Looking at the Republican army, the fact that they are mostly cloned is emblematic of an apparent need for conformity and uniformity within the Republic. Those soldiers are created and trained to look the same, act the same, and follow orders absolutely, lessening conflict. While that could be useful during a war, doing such a thing to a nation's military, a branch of civil service dedicated to the protection of the people, it'll trickle down onto civilian society, and of course interested parties can use that military uniformity to get their way in the world. In the series, those on the dark side and those who wish to see chaos dissolve will value the idea of order more than anything else. I've heard this argument many times in real life in favor of authoritarianism. The idea of order, that a certain dictator may stifle individual freedoms, but can at least be commended for maintaining order. Of course, what these people don't realize is that dictatorship is just as conducive to disorder as any other social ill. Dictatorship has always been a temporary bandage on a continually festering wound. Sometimes that bandage will carry its own infections that, once the bandage naturally loses its adhesiveness, will make the wound worse. There is a reason most modern dictatorships never last, and those dictatorships almost always create new or additional divisions that a nation needs to address once they're gone. Of course, I'm getting ahead of myself here. We may come back to this point though. So basically, many people in the Star Wars world favored granting Palpatine more and more powers in the name of restoring peace and order to the Republic. Powers that superseded democratic functions and allowed him and his allies to do as they wish with little to no obstruction. It is worth remembering that Palpatine favored the escalation of warfare to create more of a justification for his emergency powers, and that he was one of the main sponsors of the creation of the subservient clone army. Instead of just using brute force to take what he wanted, he took advantage of a conflict to advance his political and military power. In real modern history, we've seen this more times than we can count, from nations in Europe and Asia descending into fascism after the First World War because of unfair treaties, financial ruin, and nationalist ambition, to rebel leaders in Africa and other parts of Asia staying in power indefinitely after decolonization. Of course, each of those contexts are different depending on the nation or region in question, but what they all have in common is there were people who used a tough or unjust situation to justify their own authoritarianism. And so many crimes in these countries, from the silencing of the press, the suspension or elimination of democracy and or civil rights, to violence to unjust incarceration, are done in the name of preventing previous problems from arising again. This was a justification used by Palpatine and his supporters in reforming the Republic into an empire which stifled freedoms wherever it went, drained planets of their resources rapidly, and destroyed formal democratic institutions like the Senate, peacekeeping forces like the Jedi Order, and the Jedi religion itself. A line from the Queen of Naboo, Jamilia, summarized the situation in the series extremely well. The day we stop believing democracy can work is the day we lose it. This attitude contrasts the many people in the Republic who support Palpatine's greater powers, most notably Anakin, I guess, who believe that dictatorship could lead to more direct action, and the middlemen like the Senate and the Jedi only slow down the attainment of actual results. While it is true that a head of state with many powers can cut through a lot of the bureaucracy that makes politics and statecraft so tedious and frustrating, what happens when those executive powers are no longer necessary, or are in the wrong hands? Who can keep that leader in check? The former Galactic Republic had to learn that the hard way. In an ideal world, Palpatine would have given up his powers like he promised, once the Separatists were gone, and allowed the Republic to flourish in peace. But the conditions created by his emergency powers were definitely not ideal. Him and the Sith were allowed to control the government, they had a large-scale military machine to command at will, and the legal framework for their continued rule was already put in place. By the time the war was over, it was too late, and the Galactic Republic had to be restored through decades of guerrilla warfare, sabotage, and sacrifice. These are the kinds of things that happen when we give a leader and or specific interest group massive powers in the name of peace and order. The future is sacrificed for an apparent quick fix. There may be an increase in wealth and international prestige, and maybe a decrease in overt violence on the streets, but in exchange we get generations of people simmering under an inability to speak their minds or express themselves. Certain people groups favored over others, which creates near irreversible tensions, and physical and psychological torture that leaves a scar on the population. And much like the Galactic Empire in Star Wars, many dictatorships don't give up power willingly. So a lot of blood is generally shed just removing dictators from power. So anyway, that's my video. Like I said at the beginning, if I catch up to the Clone Wars, I may do a follow-up. That's if people care about this video in the first place. Anyway, my videos will become infrequent again as I enter another semester of university classes. For those who follow my content, thank you for the patience. Thanks again everyone for watching, and take care.